How's it going, everyone? It's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Latvian Gambit. The Latvian Gambit is a somewhat unusual response to the king's pawn opening. After e4, e5, we get a symmetrical king's pawn opening. White plays their most popular move here, knight to f3, and now instead of black playing one of the normal moves here, like knight to c6 defending the pawn, or knight f6, or d6, black responds with this pawn sacrifice, pawn to f5. This is, of course, a very aggressive way to play with black, immediately putting this e4 pawn under attack, and at the top levels of chess, this has always been considered somewhat of a dubious pawn sacrifice, but it can certainly be a good surprise weapon against an unsuspecting opponent. So let's see how the game can go. White actually has two ways to accept black's pawn sacrifice, because both the f5 pawn and the e5 pawn are hanging. So let's first consider e takes f5. This is white's less popular move, because now black gets to play e4 and kick this knight away. That's black's goal in the Latvian Gambit. After this knight moves to either e5 or d4, let's say knight to e5, black has to watch out for queen h5 check, really exploiting this vulnerable diagonal to the king. That's one of the big downsides of the Latvian Gambit, and one of the downsides anytime you move that f-pawn in the opening, you expose this vulnerable diagonal to the king, where the minor pieces can't block any checks on this diagonal. So after knight e5 or knight d4, black really should play knight f6 to stop the queen from giving this check. Now that this check is taken care of, though, white really has to find something active to do. Black simply threatening to play d6, kick this knight away, and then win their pawn back here on f5, when it looks like black would end up with a nice space advantage. So one of white's main moves here is bishop e2, trying to renew this threat of a check here on h5, and the game might continue with d6, bishop h5 check, king to e7, a surprising move there, allowing knight to f7, forking the rook and queen. But black has an interesting idea. Black can play queen to e8, and after white wins that rook, black will win a bishop back, queen takes h5, knight takes h5, and black is currently down the exchange, but black is hoping they can win this knight that's trapped in the corner. It turns out that that's easier said than done, though, and white actually has scored pretty well from this position. So some players with black might want to adopt an alternative approach. For example, after bishop e2, instead of allowing this check and bringing their king to e7, black might want to develop this bishop to make sure their king can at least come to the f8 square, instead of the more vulnerable e7 square after that check. So those are some examples of what can happen after e takes f5, e4. White's most popular move here is to take the e5 pawn, though, simply winning a pawn, and white has an immediate threat here to play queen h5 check. For example, if black does nothing, now queen h5 check is very strong. Queen f7 is of course a huge threat, and if black plays g6, white can just take that pawn because of the pin here on the h-file. So black has to deal with that threat, and their main move to do so is queen to f6, not only attacking this knight, but also lending more support to the g6 square. Now queen h5 of course does not work, because after g6, there's no more knight takes g6, the queen could simply take. So queen f6 is the main move, and now after d4, simply opening up more lines of development and defending that knight, black can play d6 and kick that knight away, and now the knight will usually go to the somewhat unusual c4 square as opposed to f3 or d3, because coming to those squares would allow black to take on e4 and kick that knight again. So knight c4 is the main move. Black does win their pawn back here with f takes e4, but after knight c3, white has a sizable lead in development. White's possibly threatening to play knight d5, which could be very annoying for black. White's possibly threatening to win this pawn back, although they have to watch out for this fork with d5 forking the knights. Black will usually play queen g6 here to defend the e4 pawn, and to put some pressure here against g2 to discourage white from developing this bishop. And now white has many ways to play. f3 has been a popular move that scores very well for white. Simply exchanging off this weak pawn, white's not going to try to win any material. White just wants to open up lines to exploit their lead in development. That's one possibility. Also, knight to e3 is a very reasonable move, just defending that the g2 pawn with the knight, freeing this bishop to develop, and white's still going to get a lead in development. Knight d5 might be an issue later for black if black's not careful. I'll just show one sample line of how one game continued. Black played knight f6, white played bishop e2, black played c6, not only stopping knight d5, but also preparing to possibly play d5 themselves and really cement this e4 pawn in there. And black would have a space advantage, but black's really far behind in development. White played f3 trying to open up the position. E takes f3, bishop takes f3, d5, queen e2, and now black had to play the ugly king d8, which looks ridiculous. But what else can black play? The missing f-pawn here really weakens the e-file. There's no more bishop e6 really shutting down this file. That could be met, of course, by knight takes d5, and that bishop would be hanging. And if there's no bishop e6, what else can black really play? Bishop e7 might also run into knight takes d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5. And white actually has tremendous compensation here despite being down a piece. White is actually close to winning. After knight takes d5, there's bishop h5 winning the queen. And of course, if you can't take that knight, what are you going to do about this bishop? You can maybe try knight c6, defending the bishop for now, but there's still knight c7 to reckon with. So black's pretty much busted in this line unless they play the really ugly move king to d8, and white stood much better in this position. Going back here to move 3, black has sometimes tried a move besides queen f6. For example, knight c6 has been played. This is considered rather dubious because it does not stop queen h5 check, but black has an idea here. After g6, white does get to take that pawn, but now black throws in the in-between move, knight to f6. White can retreat that queen, and now black gets to save their rook with rook to g8. And black's hoping that this extra move developing this knight could prove useful. Maybe this knight could play to d4 at some point and attack this vulnerable c2 pawn. And of course this knight on g6 is loose for now. Black's threatening to take it. If white tries to exchange off that knight with knight takes f8, black can play the in-between move here, rook to g4 attacking the queen and threatening rook takes e4 check. White has tried queen h6 here in a few games, which hasn't worked too well. Queen h3 might be an improvement, just keeping the queen on a more flexible square where it watches over the king side a little bit better. But of course, if white ends up defending this attack, then black really has serious long-term concerns about their king safety here. That king is extremely exposed without the g-pawn on the board, and this diagonal is going to keep being a concern for black in the future. But because black does succeed in getting an attack here after rook g4, some players with white won't go for this, and after knight c6, they won't play queen h5 check. White could simply take on c6 and give black doubled pawns. For example, after d takes c6, d4, white stands pretty well here. White controls the full center, white has open lines for their pieces, black has doubled pawns, and white's not really worried about f takes e4 yet because now queen h5 would again be very strong. Now that this pawn is not on f5, this queen has access to the e5 square, and that means that black can't play g6 anymore because of queen e5 forking the king and rook, a very common tactic that we know from many different openings. Coming back here to the starting position of the Latvian Gambit, we talked about knight takes e5 and e takes f5. Let's just briefly consider some other moves that white might play. d3 looks like a possible move just defending this pawn, but of course this is very passive, especially because accepting the gambit usually gives white an advantage. Here, black could probably just play d6 and go back into a Philidor defense, but of course white will almost never play this move d3 on the Philidor defense and block in their bishop. This is a pretty passive setup from white, but white's certainly fine here. After f5, white also sometimes plays this move bishop c4, getting on this weakened diagonal here. And the idea is that after f takes e4, knight takes e5, it's really hard for black to stop all the threats here. If black played d5 to shut down the bishop, then queen h5 again is a big threat. And otherwise, knight f7 or bishop f7 might be a threat. But black has this surprising blow queen g5 just attacking the g2 pawn, and this leads to some very forcing continuations. This particular line I'm about to show is actually called the Duke of Courland variation, so with a name like that, you know we're about to see some romantic era 1800 style attacking chess. So let's see it. d4, just opening up this bishop to attack that queen. Queen takes g2, queen h5, g6, bishop f7, king d8, and bishop takes g6. White sacrifices this rook in the corner for the sake of really exposing this black king here on d8. After queen takes h1, king e2, this queen is kind of out of play in the corner, and it's too slow to take this bishop here on c1. Black would be getting checkmated. Go ahead and pause your video if you want to try to find white's main threat. But if black were to play queen takes c1, then after knight f7, king e7, queen e5 would be checkmate. So black does not want to go for that. After king to e2, black usually plays c6, giving their king a little breathing room. And after, for example, knight c3, just continuing to develop and defending this bishop. Knight f6, queen g5, just pinning that knight. We're left with a rather crazy position, but white has actually scored pretty well here as well. This king is simply very weak. Thank you very much for watching, and please make sure you visit chesspathways.com right now. I'll put a link down in the description, and make sure you get signed up there. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. I'm trying to help more chess players become masters, hopefully in a fraction of the time that it took me. Thanks, and I'll see you there.